January 23rd, 1945. 0730 hours. A storage bunker 3 kilometers east of Clark Field, Luzon. Major Hideaki Tanaka of the Imperial Japanese Army's 14th Area Army knelt beside an overturned American supply crate, his hands trembling as he read the shipping manifest. The crate, abandoned during a hasty American advance, contained nothing remarkable, just standard infantry rations. But the quantity notation made his breath catch. 1 of 12,000, batch 742. He spoke the words aloud, as if hearing them might make them less impossible. This cannot be accurate. They must mean 12,000 for the entire month. What Major Tanaka didn't know was that he held in his hands evidence of a reality so vast, so overwhelming, that understanding it would transform his conception of the war, his nation's prospects, and the very nature of industrial civilization. The crate contained 48 individual K-ration packages, each one wrapped in waxed cardboard more substantial than the paper his own division used for official documents. Inside each package, tinned meat, concentrated chocolate, cigarettes, toilet paper, instant coffee, sugar tablets, and chewing gum. Tanaka calculated quickly. If this was truly one of 12,000 such crates in a single batch, and batch 742 implied there had been at least that many previous batches then. He stopped, unwilling to complete the thought. His battalion of 900 men received a rice delivery once every 8 days. Each soldier consumed approximately 600 grams daily. This single American crate contained more processed food than his entire battalion would receive in a week. If this is what they discard, he whispered. What do they keep? The mathematics were staggering. By the time American forces had secured their Lingayen beachhead in early January 1945, they had landed 175,000 troops in the first few days. General Douglas MacArthur commanded 280,000 men on Luzon alone, more than General Dwight Eisenhower had deployed in the campaigns for North Africa, Italy, or southern France combined. Against this force, General Tomoyuki Yamashita could field approximately 260,000 Japanese troops spread across the entire Philippine archipelago. And unlike the Americans, these men would receive no reinforcements, no resupply, no evacuation if wounded. The disparity in firepower was even more absolute. For every artillery shell Yamashita's artillery could fire, American guns could fire 50. For every gallon of fuel available to Japanese vehicles, American supply lines delivered 200. The United States had transported to Luzon, in less than 1 month, more tonnage of supplies than Japan had shipped to all its forces in the Philippines during the entire previous year of occupation. But these numbers, had Tanaka known them, would have seemed merely abstract, the sort of statistics that commanders discussed in briefing rooms far from the reality of jungle warfare. What made the reality undeniable was the physical evidence that accumulated around him daily. The concrete manifestations of industrial disparity so vast it approached the incomprehensible. Major Tanaka had arrived in the Philippines in June 1943 as part of the 8th Division, bringing with him 15 years of military service and the confident assumption that Japanese warrior spirit, tactical excellence, and intimate knowledge of Asian terrain would offset any material advantages the Americans might possess. He had fought in Manchuria, where Soviet forces, despite their numbers, had proven vulnerable to Japanese aggression. He had studied the early Pacific campaigns where Japanese forces, outnumbered and fighting far from home, had nevertheless seized territory with remarkable speed. The Philippines themselves had fallen to Japanese conquest in 5 months, despite fierce American and Filipino resistance. Why, he had reasoned, would the reverse conquest prove any easier for the enemy? By January 1945, Tanaka commanded a battalion defending the approaches to Clark Field, the air base that American forces had captured on the same day he discovered the supply crate. His orders from General Yamashita were clear. Delay the American advance, conserve ammunition, make them pay for every meter of ground. Yamashita had split his forces, sending 152,000 troops into the mountains of northern Luzon and 70,000 to defend Manila and southern positions. 30,000 more defended the city itself, though Tanaka had heard rumors that Yamashita had actually ordered Manila declared an open city to spare civilian casualties. The strategy was sound, Tanaka believed. Draw out the campaign, force the Americans to fight for every position, bleed them until they tired of the cost. What Tanaka could not have known, examining that abandoned supply crate in the weak dawn light filtering through camouflage netting, was that his entire battalion's supply situation for the coming month? Every grain of rice, every rifle cartridge, every bandage, and every soldier represented less material and human resources than the United States Army routinely devoted to a single day's operations on Luzon. The scale of disparity was not merely quantitative. It represented a fundamental difference in the type of war being fought. The first revelation came 3 hours later. At 10:30 hours, Tanaka led a patrol to investigate an abandoned American forward position. The enemy had pulled back during the night, part of their rapid advance toward Manila, 100 miles to the south. Tanaka approached cautiously, expecting booby traps, mines, or even a planned ambush. Instead, he found what appeared to be the aftermath of a dinner party. The foxholes and fighting positions showed evidence of occupation by approximately 30 soldiers. They had left behind 15 unopened C-ration cans, 8 full cigarette packages, 3 functional flashlights with fresh batteries, 2 complete field medical kits containing bandages, sulfa powder, morphine ampules, and surgical thread, and most remarkably, a working field radio. Tanaka examined each item with growing confusion. His own standing orders required soldiers to account for every spent cartridge. Wasting ammunition meant disciplinary action. Losing equipment meant possible execution. Yet here lay American supplies, functional and valuable, simply abandoned because carrying them proved inconvenient during a rapid advance. Sergeant Yoshiro Matsumoto, a veteran who had fought in China since 1937, picked up one of the medical kits and opened it with the reverence one might show a religious artifact. "Sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "this contains more morphine than our entire division received last month, and they just left it." The sergeant was 41 years old enough to remember when Japan's modern military seemed invincible, young enough to have spent most of his adult life at war. He would survive the Philippines campaign and later testify. That morning, I understood for the first time that we were not fighting soldiers like ourselves. We were fighting an enemy to whom the supplies we treasured were too trivial to bother collecting. It was like discovering your opponent in a contest, plays by entirely different rules. Rules where nothing we valued held any importance to them whatsoever. But it was the radio that captured Tanaka's attention. He ordered it brought back to battalion headquarters. His communications officer, Lieutenant Kenji Sato, examined it with professional interest. 26 years old, Sato had trained in communications in Tokyo and considered himself knowledgeable about radio technology. "This is a SCR-300, he explained to Tanaka. "American manufacture, standard issue for company-level operations." He paused, studying the construction. "Sir, the casing alone uses more metal than our entire battalion's radio allocation. and according to intelligence briefings, every American company has several of these. Tanaka did the mathematics. If every American company possessed multiple radios of this quality, and a division contained perhaps 60 to 70 companies, including support units, then a single American division possessed more radio communications capability than Yamashita's entire army group. How do they manufacture so many? He asked. Sato's answer would haunt Tanaka. Sir, I don't think they even consider this many. To them, this must be normal. The pattern emerged over the following week. As American forces pushed inland from their Lingayen beachhead, Tanaka's battalion conducted a fighting withdrawal, engaging where favorable, retreating before superior force. The standard tactical approach. But each abandoned, American position revealed the same impossible abundance. On January 27th, Tanaka's scouts reported an American supply dump left unguarded during a command post relocation. Tanaka led a platoon to investigate, hoping to capture weapons or ammunition his battalion desperately needed. What they found instead challenged every assumption about military logistics. The dump contained 40 trucks, diesel fuel for transport, 47,000 rounds of small arms ammunition, 200 mortar shells, 600 artillery rounds for 105mm howitzers, medical supplies sufficient for 1,000 men for a month, and enough food to feed 3,000 soldiers for 2 weeks. All of it left behind because the American advance had moved so rapidly that bringing up fresh supplies proved easier than retrieving the old stockpile. Private First Class Hiroshi Yamada, age 19, who had been conscripted 18 months earlier and had never seen combat before Luzon, stood amid the stacked crates and wept. "We're starving," he said, not to anyone in particular, simply giving voice to the reality all of them lived with daily. "We ration 6 bullets per man. We haven't received fresh food in 23 days. And they abandon this because it's inconvenient?" Tanaka ordered his men to take whatever they could carry. They spent 3 hours loading packs and commandeering an American truck they managed to start. They carried away perhaps 2% of what lay there. The rest they destroyed, but the destruction felt futile. Tanaka wrote in his diary that evening, "If this is what they consider unimportant enough to abandon, what does their main supply line look like? How can we fight an enemy who treats our most desperate needs as garbage?" The scale became clear through accumulated evidence. On January 31st, forward American elements reached Manila. Tanaka's battalion, now reduced to 730 men through casualties and disease, had withdrawn to defensive positions in the mountains northeast of the capital. From these positions, they could observe American air operations over Clark Field, now back in American hands. Lieutenant Ichiro Nakamura, the battalion's artillery spotter, counted aircraft. 29 years old, Nakamura had exceptional eyesight and a meticulous nature. He maintained a log. January 31st, he recorded. Between 0600 and 1800 hours, observed 214 takeoffs and landings at Clark Field. Estimated 132 fighters, 67 bombers, 15 transport aircraft. February 1st, 243 operations. February 2nd, 197 operations. He would continue this count for 3 weeks, until American infantry overran his observation post. In his final entry, he calculated that Clark Field alone, one of several American airfields in Luzon, was conducting more daily flight operations than the entire remaining Japanese Air Force in the Philippines could attempt in a week. But numbers on paper remained abstract. The human dimension made the scale tangible. Corporal Takeshi Ito, a 33-year-old farmer from Nagano Prefecture, captured the reality in testimony given after the war. We would hear them coming, the American bombers, flying in formations of 9 or 12 aircraft. So many engines the sound was like continuous thunder. They flew at whatever altitude they chose because we had no fighters and almost no anti-aircraft ammunition. They would pass over, and we would count the bombs falling. I remember one attack on a bridge near our position. They dropped what must have been 60 bombs to destroy one bridge. 60 bombs! We would plan operations for a week to use 60 bombs. They used them to make certain of one bridge. After the bombing, the engineers would arrive with Bailey bridge equipment and have a replacement bridge functioning within a day. The speed of it, the casual certainty that whatever they destroyed, they could replace within hours, not months. That's when I understood. We were fighting people who could afford to use sledgehammers to crack walnuts. We were fighting with our hands. The paradigm shattered completely on February 3rd, when American forces entered Manila. Tanaka's battalion was too far from the city to participate in its defense. But refugees fleeing north brought stories that seemed impossible, yet proved undeniably true. Master Sergeant Koji Fujimoto, age 38, interrogated prisoners and refugees as part of intelligence gathering. They described American tanks rolling down Rizal Avenue like they were parade vehicles. Fujimoto later testified. Not a careful advance with infantry support and reconnaissance. Just tanks driving down main streets at 20 kilometers per hour with soldiers sitting on top of them, as if they were sightseeing. When I asked about Japanese defensive fire, the refugees said yes. There was some fighting. But the Americans seemed almost casual about it, calling in artillery or airstrikes whenever they encountered resistance, then continuing forward once the resistance was eliminated. They fought like men who knew they had infinite resources and infinite time, except they didn't act like they had infinite time. They acted like they were in a hurry but faced no real obstacles. That combination, the urgency without any apparent concern about cost, that's what convinced me we couldn't win. They were playing a different game entirely. The human dimension became tragically clear through the battle for Manila itself. Vice Admiral Denshichi Okochi, commanding the Japanese naval forces in the city, defied General Yamashita's orders to declare Manila an open city. With approximately 20,000 troops, mostly naval infantry and support personnel, Okochi fortified the city and engaged in a month-long defense that ended in the destruction of the Philippine capital. But it was not the battle itself that revealed the disparity. It was the aftermath. Captain Masao Watanabe, assigned to Yamashita's headquarters staff, entered Manila on March 5th, 2 days after the city was declared secure. 35 years old, a career officer who had served in Malaya and Burma before assignment to the Philippines. Watanabe later provided extensive testimony about what he observed. Manila was rubble. 80% of the southern residential district destroyed. The entire business district leveled. They had bombarded their own city with artillery rather than allow Japanese troops to hold it. But what struck me was the speed of the reconstruction. Within days of the city being secured, American engineers had temporary water systems functioning. They brought in electrical generators. They established field hospitals that were treating Filipino civilians. I watched American bulldozers clearing streets, and there must have been 40 of them working simultaneously. 40 bulldozers in one city. My entire division had 3 trucks, 2 of which didn't function for lack of fuel or spare parts. The Americans were rebuilding a destroyed city while still fighting us in the countryside. The allocation of resources to non-combat operations exceeded our entire combat capability. What Watanabe didn't mention in his formal testimony but wrote in a letter to his wife that survived the war, was his growing horror at what Japanese forces had done to Manila's civilian population. "The stories emerging from the city are too terrible to write in detail," he recorded. "Our forces committed atrocities that shame the uniform and dishonor our nation. The Americans discovered evidence of systematic murder, rape, and torture of Filipino civilians. Babies murdered in front of their parents. Hospitals set ablaze with patients inside. 100,000 Filipinos killed, most of them civilians. When this becomes known in Japan, when our children learn what was done in our nation's name, they will ask us how we allowed such things. I have no answer to give them." The contrast between American conduct and Japanese atrocities became another dimension of Tanaka's education. Filipino civilians, who had every reason to hate all foreign occupiers after 3 years of Japanese brutality, welcomed American forces with open enthusiasm. Major Tanaka observed this from his mountain positions. "They cheered them," he wrote in his diary on February 10th. "Actual cheering, as if liberators had arrived. And from what I can observe, the Americans treat them with basic humanity. Medical care for civilians, food distribution, protection from reprisal. These should be normal military behaviors. But in contrast to what our forces have done, they appear as remarkable generosity. We have created our own enemies among the population. Every Filipino who might have been neutral or even sympathetic to Asian solidarity against Western colonialism now sees America as savior and Japan as oppressor. The political dimension of this is perhaps worse than the material disparity. We have lost any possible legitimacy in this region. The effectiveness of Filipino resistance forces provided another revelation. By 1944, 180,000 Filipinos served in various resistance organizations. 1 in 6 of these belonged to Louis Taruk's Hukbalahaps, the Huks, a Marxist-led group whose primary loyalty was to Douglas MacArthur's promise to return. From his mountain headquarters, Tanaka tried to counter guerrilla operations. It proved impossible. Lieutenant Sato, the communications officer, explained why. They know the terrain. They know the language. Every civilian is a potential intelligence source for them and a security risk for us. But most importantly, they have radio contact with American forces. They coordinate their operations with American movements. They cut our communications cables the night before American attacks. They ambush our supply convoys with precise information about routes and timing. They are, effectively, a front-line division working in perfect coordination with American conventional forces. We are not fighting Filipino guerrillas. We are fighting American intelligence with Filipino operatives. The sophistication of their coordination suggests training, equipment, and most importantly, radio nets that we cannot interdict. MacArthur has been supplying them by submarine for months. They have better communications than we do. One such resistance leader, Lieutenant Colonel Guillermo Nakar, had been captured and executed in 1942 after Japanese intelligence intercepted his reports to MacArthur's Australian headquarters. The Japanese secret police believed his organization would collapse. Instead, as MacArthur later noted, a new leader rose to continue the work. By January 1945, the guerrillas were sending nearly 4,000 radio messages monthly to Australian intelligence, detailing everything from troop movements to the guest list at the Manila Hotel. Tanaka's battalion encountered this network directly on February 15th. A supply convoy, carrying the battalion's first rice delivery in 11 days, was ambushed 20 kilometers from Tanaka's position. 30 trucks, carrying enough food for 2,000 men for a week, destroyed or captured. The ambush was executed with precision. Explosives on the road disabled the lead and rear vehicles. Small arms fire killed the drivers and guards. Then the attackers melted into the jungle before any response could be organized. The convoy commander, Captain Hiroaki Yamamoto, survived and reported to Tanaka. They knew exactly where we would be. They knew our timing, our route, our strength. They hit us at the most vulnerable point of the road, where we couldn't maneuver or retreat easily. It wasn't lucky. It was planned with intelligence we cannot possibly counter. And, sir, Yamamoto added quietly, the guerrillas were using American weapons, brand new ones. They have better rifles than we do. The psychological transformation began in incremental shifts. The accumulation of evidence that forced Tanaka to question assumptions he had held his entire military career. The first stage was denial. Throughout February, as his battalion shrank through attrition to fewer than 500 men, as rations decreased to one meal every other day, as wounded soldiers died from lack of medical supplies, Tanaka told himself this was temporary. The Americans were overextended. Their supply lines would falter. Japanese reinforcements would arrive. The Imperial Navy would break through to resupply the Philippines. These were the standard calculations of operational planning. If the situation looked dire, it was because war was always difficult. Victory required perseverance. On February 18th, the delusion cracked. An American supply convoy was spotted moving along a coastal road within visual range of Tanaka's observation post. Lieutenant Nakamura counted trucks. "Sir," he reported, "I count 237 vehicles in the convoy. They're moving at approximately 30 kilometers per hour. If each truck carries standard cargo load, that's..." He did the calculation. "That's more supplies than our entire corps receives in a month. And according to intelligence briefings, this is one of dozens of convoys operating daily." Tanaka stared through binoculars at the convoy, watching truck after truck roll past. They moved without apparent concern about ambush or air attack, secure in the knowledge that Japanese forces no longer possessed the capability to threaten their operations. If they can afford to operate convoys that size openly, Tanaka said slowly, then our intelligence estimates of their supply capacity must be wrong by orders of magnitude. If those estimates are wrong, then our operational planning is based on false assumptions. If our planning is false, then... He stopped, unwilling to complete the thought. Sergeant Matsumoto completed it for him. "Then we cannot win, sir, if we ever could have." The stage of doubt consumed the next 2 weeks. Tanaka found himself calculating impossibilities. If the Americans could land 175,000 troops in days, how many ships did that require? If they could conduct hundreds of air operations daily from one airfield, how many aircraft did they possess total? If they could abandon supply dumps containing enough materiel for thousands of men and consider it inconsequential, what were their total production numbers? Every calculation led to numbers that seemed fantastical. Yet the evidence kept mounting. On March 1st, American forces secured central Manila. Tanaka received reports through his intelligence network. The city was destroyed, resembling Warsaw in scale of devastation. Only one other city in World War II had suffered comparable damage. 70% of utilities destroyed. 75% of factories leveled. 80% of southern residential districts in rubble. The entire business district obliterated. Yet already the reports indicated American engineering units were rebuilding. How do they do this? Tanaka asked Watanabe during a courier meeting. How do they destroy a city and simultaneously begin rebuilding it while still fighting us? Watanabe's answer was stark. Because they can afford to allocate resources to both operations simultaneously. We must choose. Fight or rebuild. They do both. That is the difference between their economy and ours. It's not that they have more resources. It's that they have so many more resources, they don't face choices we consider fundamental. The acceptance came suddenly, triggered not by any single revelation, but by the accumulated weight of evidence that could no longer be rationalized. It was March 9th, and Tanaka was reading an intelligence summary. The report detailed American operations across Luzon. 14 separate offensives operating simultaneously. Coordinated airstrikes supporting each ground operation. Naval gunfire providing additional support in coastal areas. Supply lines functioning without apparent strain. Medical evacuation by air for wounded personnel. Filipino guerrillas coordinating with American forces at multiple points. Japanese defensive positions being bypassed rather than assaulted directly, isolated and left to wither without supply. Tanaka set down the report and looked at his officers. They were meeting in a cave that served as battalion headquarters. 10 men, representing what remained of the command structure. All were undernourished. Most had untreated wounds or tropical diseases. They had ammunition for perhaps 2 more days of intensive combat. Food for 4 days. No prospect of resupply. The battalion itself numbered 420 men, down from 900 3 months earlier. Not from battle casualties primarily, but from disease, starvation, and desertion. "Gentlemen," Tanaka said quietly, "I believe we have been fighting under a fundamental misunderstanding." He gestured to the intelligence report. "We assumed this was a normal military campaign where both sides possessed comparable capabilities, and victory would be determined by tactics, morale, and fighting spirit. We were wrong. The Americans are not fighting the same war we are. They are fighting an industrial war where material abundance allows approaches we cannot counter. We are fighting a war of scarcity where every bullet matters. These are not compatible paradigms. We cannot win this war." The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Lieutenant Sato spoke. "Sir, if we cannot win, what are we fighting for?" Tanaka had asked himself this question for weeks. The answer was both simple and complex. We fight because we have orders. We fight because we are soldiers. We fight because honor demands it. But we no longer fight because victory is possible. We fight to delay defeat. That is our mission now. Delay the American advance so that... He paused. So that what? So the homeland can prepare defenses? So diplomatic solutions can be found? I don't know. But those are strategic questions above our level. Our tactical reality is that we will fight with what we have until we can fight no more. The psychological burden of this recognition manifested physically. Tanaka developed insomnia. He would lie awake calculating the mathematics of impossibility. His diary entries from mid-March became increasingly focused on resource comparisons. One American division receives more supply tonnage in a week than Yamashita's entire army receives in a month. One American soldier consumes more calories daily than 2 Japanese soldiers. The average American infantry company possesses more radio equipment than a Japanese regiment. These are not the margins of war. These are different civilizations making war. On March 23rd, Tanaka's battalion was ordered to participate in a counterattack against American positions near San Jose. It was a futile operation, designed only to delay American movement into the mountains where the majority of Japanese forces had withdrawn. Tanaka briefed his company commanders. "We have ammunition for approximately 1 hour of combat. After that, we will rely on grenades and bayonets. The objective is to disrupt their advance for 12 hours, allowing the 1st Division to establish new defensive positions. Expected casualties, 30 to 40%. Questions? Captain Yamamoto asked the question all of them were thinking. Sir, after we've expended our ammunition and suffered our casualties to delay them by 12 hours, what have we accomplished? They'll bring up fresh troops, more ammunition than we fired in total, and be back at full strength tomorrow. We'll be weaker. The mathematics don't work. No, Tanaka agreed. The mathematics don't work. They haven't worked since January, but we have our orders. The counterattack achieved its objective. Tanaka's battalion assaulted American positions at dawn, achieving surprise and initial success. They held the position for 9 hours before American artillery and air support made continuation impossible. Tanaka withdrew with 217 men remaining. They had inflicted an estimated 80 American casualties. The mathematics of attrition were brutal. Japanese forces were being eliminated at rates 3 to 4 times higher than American casualties. And unlike the Americans, Japanese losses could not be replaced. But it was during the withdrawal that Tanaka experienced the final revelation. As his men retreated through the jungle, an American artillery barrage provided covering fire for pursuing infantry. The volume of fire was stunning. Tanaka estimated that in 30 minutes, American artillery fired more rounds than his entire division possessed in total. The bombardment was not aimed at specific targets. It was area suppression, designed to make retreat costly. The Americans were expending ammunition at rates that would bankrupt Japanese supply systems simply to slow a retreating force. Sergeant Matsumoto, stumbling beside Tanaka through the undergrowth, said, "They're not even trying to be efficient. They're just drowning us in fire." "Efficiency implies scarcity," Tanaka replied. "They have no scarcity. Efficiency is irrelevant when you have abundance." The broader context became clear through intelligence summaries that reached even isolated units like Tanaka's battalion. By late March, the Philippines campaign's outline was evident. American forces had landed over 400,000 troops across the archipelago. They controlled all major ports and air bases. They were systematically clearing Japanese forces from every island, not because holding every island was strategically necessary, but because MacArthur had made a personal commitment to liberate all Filipino territory. The campaign was criticized, even within American military leadership, as an unnecessary expenditure of lives for objectives that had limited strategic value. The criticism itself revealed the disparity. Americans could debate whether to expend resources clearing every Japanese soldier from every Philippine island because they possessed surplus capability for such operations. Japanese forces didn't debate such questions. They fought wherever they were because they had no capacity for strategic choice. The industrial foundations underlying this disparity were staggering. Beginning in December 1944, after American occupation of Mindoro, the flow of oil into Japan had been cut to nearly zero. In September 1944, 700,000 tons of tanker shipping had ferried oil and rubber from Southeast Asian ports to the Japanese home islands. By December, that tonnage had fallen to 2,000. Japan's entire war machine, its aircraft, ships, tanks, trucks, all dependent on petroleum, was slowly grinding to a halt for lack of fuel. Meanwhile, American forces in the Philippines consumed petroleum products at rates that exceeded total Japanese petroleum imports, even during pre-war periods. The United States was using more oil to conquer the Philippines than Japan used for its entire Pacific War effort. Food told a similar story. An American soldier in the Philippines consumed approximately 3,800 calories daily through rations that included fresh meat when available. canned vegetables, bread, coffee, chocolate, cigarettes, and even occasional fresh fruit brought forward by supply ships. A Japanese soldier, if fortunate, consumed 1,200 calories of rice, occasionally supplemented with tinned fish or vegetables. The average American soldier gained weight during the Philippines campaign. The average Japanese soldier lost 20 to 30% of body weight. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making tropical diseases more deadly. By April 1945, more Japanese soldiers in the Philippines were dying from disease and starvation than from combat. The technological gap extended beyond basic supplies. American forces employed coordination technologies that seemed science-fictional to Japanese observers. Radar directed their artillery fire. Aircraft carriers positioned offshore served as mobile air bases, eliminating the need for land bases. Landing craft delivered tanks and artillery directly onto beaches, bypassing port facilities entirely. Radio networks coordinated operations across hundreds of miles instantaneously. Japanese forces, watching these operations, felt like medieval soldiers observing industrial warfare. The gap wasn't merely quantitative, it was epical. Lieutenant Nakamura, the meticulous observer who had counted aircraft sorties, survived until May, and later provided testimony that captured this technological disparity. I watched them call in an airstrike once. An American forward observer, just one man, used a radio to request air support. Within 15 minutes, 4 aircraft appeared and bombed the target he specified. 15 minutes from request to delivery. Our procedure for requesting air support required written requests passed through multiple command levels, approval at division level, coordination with Air Force headquarters, and assuming aircraft were available and fuel existed, the sortie might occur within 3 to 4 days. They had institutionalized what we considered extraordinary into routine procedure. That's not a technological advantage. That's a different way of making war. The human toll mounted with mechanical inevitability. By June, Tanaka's battalion had ceased to exist as a functional military unit. Of the original 900 men, 73 remained. They had withdrawn into the mountains of northern Luzon, surviving on foraged food and whatever supplies they could salvage. No medical care, no resupply, no communication with higher headquarters. They were not soldiers anymore, merely survivors. Tanaka's final diary entry, dated June 18, 1945, read, "We have become ghosts, not dead, but no longer truly alive. The war continues somewhere, but we are no longer part of it. The Americans don't even bother to hunt us. We pose no threat. Our elimination is inevitable and requires no special effort. They simply need to wait for hunger and disease to do what their weapons would accomplish more quickly, but at some minimal cost in ammunition. Even our deaths are not worth the expenditure." On June 30th, 1945, the Philippines were officially declared secure. On July 5th, MacArthur announced that the entire archipelago was liberated. In practice, Japanese soldiers continued to hide in mountains and jungles for weeks or months, some not surrendering until years after the war's end. But they were militarily irrelevant, cut-off remnants of a defeated force. The final statistics told the story with brutal clarity. Japanese forces in the Philippines suffered 205,535 killed and 9,050 captured. American forces suffered 8,310 killed and 29,560 wounded. The casualty ratio approached 7-to-1, but even this understated the disparity. American wounded received medical care that saved perhaps 70% of casualties who survived initial trauma. Japanese wounded, lacking medical supplies, died from injuries that American medicine would have treated routinely. The effective killing ratio exceeded 10 to 1. 17 American divisions had fought against 23 Japanese divisions. The Americans annihilated their opposition while suffering historically low casualty rates. The difference wasn't courage or tactical skill. Japanese soldiers fought with desperate determination. They held positions against overwhelming firepower. They conducted counterattacks knowing they would fail. But determination cannot defeat industrial superiority of the magnitude the United States deployed. At one point, MacArthur's headquarters reported that the campaign cost 820 American lives, while killing over 12,000 Japanese, a ratio approaching 15 to 1. These weren't battles. They were industrial elimination processes. Major Hideaki Tanaka survived the war. He surrendered on August 18, 1945, 3 days after the Emperor's radio announcement. He weighed 43 kilograms, having lost 36 kilograms from his pre-war weight. He spent 2 years in Allied custody before repatriation to Japan. In interviews conducted in the 1960s, he reflected on the Philippines campaign. I believed we were fighting Americans who possessed certain material advantages, but who lacked our fighting spirit and willingness to sacrifice. I believed that with proper tactics and determination, we could offset their material superiority. I was comprehensively wrong. They didn't lack spirit. They fought effectively and bravely. But they fought within a system that made our best efforts irrelevant. They could afford mistakes we couldn't. They could accept costs we couldn't. They could sustain operations we couldn't. The gap wasn't one of degree. It was one of kind. We were fighting an industrial civilization with an agricultural nation's resources. The outcome was never in doubt, only the duration and the cost. The crate that Tanaka examined on January 23, 1945, which seemed so remarkable for its contents and its documentation suggesting vast quantities beyond, actually represented something more profound than he initially understood. It wasn't unusual. It wasn't a logistical anomaly. It was normal. The United States had built an industrial system capable of producing such abundance that individual items became effectively disposable. The food, medical supplies, and equipment that Tanaka treasured as precious rarities were, to American logistics, forgettable trivia. The war in the Philippines wasn't won by tactics or courage. It was won by factories in Detroit, shipyards in California, oil refineries in Texas, and farms in Iowa. By the time soldiers fought on Luzon, the outcome had been determined by the industrial capacity deployed. The soldiers were merely executing decisions made by economies. Today, a single K ration package resides in the National Museum of the Philippines in Manila, displayed alongside Japanese equipment from the campaign. The exhibit includes a Japanese Type 99 rifle, a sword carried by an officer, and various personal effects. The American ration package, mundane and mass-produced, sits among items of individual craftsmanship. Museum guides explain to visitors that the contrast illustrates the nature of the Pacific War. Japanese soldiers carried weapons made by hand, each one requiring hours of skilled labor. American soldiers carried rations produced in quantities of millions, each one identical, each one discarded after use. The rifles survived because they were valuable. The ration package survived by accident, one of billions, now representative of the industrial abundance that determined the war's outcome.